You're watching LaRouche PAC Strategic Update for Monday, December 4th with Mike Stager, and this is Tony Pappert. I'll be moderating. So why don't we begin? Tonight, Monday, it's just 6 weeks until the Iowa caucus, January 15th. So the 2024 election is now fully on. And as Donald Trump has frequently said, it's not just the most important election in our lifetime. It's perhaps the most important presidential election in our nation's history, certainly rivaling the election of 1860, which probably decided in that election whether our nation would continue or not, lasted just a few years. The adversary is apoplectic. We took note in our Saturday class 2 days ago of a hysterical, rambling op-ed by neocon Robert Kagan in the Washington Post, who drew heavily on Shakespeare's Julius Caesar to, in effect, beg some citizen to come, or non-citizen, to come forward and assassinate dictator Donald Trump, the way the Roman Cassius and his friends assassinated Julius Caesar in Shakespeare's play. In our Saturday class, Barbara Boyd drew the lessons from a major exposure by Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger of the British intelligence hand behind the whole, what they call the censorship industrial complex, the whole apparatus that has been censoring the online news and views of Americans illegally, especially since 2015 and 2016. Tonight, Mike is going to carry that further, and especially with a view to the experiences of the younger strata of our citizens, who have tended, because of their history, relatively speaking, to stand aloof from this struggle which pits the Trump MAGA movement against our nation's historic enemy of the British Empire. And Mike, of course, is younger, certainly younger than me. He's made a study of these factors which have shaped the outlook of this generation since the George W. Bush, but more especially the 2 terms of Barack Obama. So I think with that, why don't you take it away, Mike?
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. So, yeah, as Tony said, I want to take up a certain part of, as really the strategic focus that I think best explains or helps us not just explain or understand, but helps us act effectively, which is what strategic assessments are for, right? There's lots of people, too many people practically, but everybody now is an expert out there, and there's tons of strategic assessments, and many of them narrow their scope to the Ukraine war or the Middle East, or and some of them are very useful, but the ones that really only matter, and this is really this kind of school of LaRouche, the strategic assessments that are worth anything are ones that provide clarity on the means to act. And I think that to some degree, with the new intelligence revelations from Matt Taibbi, Schellenberger, Alex Gutentag was the 3rd author on this report, that they don't bring the strategic. They're adding another kind of piece of information that, as they put it, fills out the timeline of the Twitter files and the kind of Russiagate federal government, private corporation, the public-private partnership in social media, in censorship, and so on. But Barbara touched on something that's very specific, and so I want to get into that tonight. Let me just say before I do that, as Tony said, what we've seen from the MAGA movement over the last 7-8 years, and especially consolidated in November of 2020, was a kind of engagement from many people who were Trump's main polemic, "Make America Great Again," struck a very strong nerve. And many of those people were within the post-war generation, what are sometimes called baby boomers. Increasingly, that term is derisive. So I'll include the larger name as post-war generation and leave the boomers to be the more problematic elements like the Clintons or the Bushes, the various people you can think of and predominant in Washington and Wall Street and every corporation in our country. But it's been that post-war generation had a memory of a time when the nation was coherent, productive, industrial, optimistic, looked to solve big challenges, looked to help advance and build the world, conquer space. But of course, that a lot of those perspectives shifted. And Trump himself lived that personally. But what's almost uncanny in how it's manifest so deliberately, even in the kind of polling today, the younger generations have already shifted towards Trump versus Biden at this point. And in some ways, you could say, well, when Trump says "Make America Great Again," they go, well, it was at least certainly better. If it wasn't great, it was better a few years ago. If we can make it like that, that would certainly be better than what we have today. And if linearly projected, this trajectory is near annihilation. So it's somewhat understandable that the younger people are now at least starting to see a difference. And that difference is really a question of Trump having brought to bear a sense of the truth. One example would certainly be on the open border. Now, it's far worse today than it was even when Trump opened with that polemic in 2015 to launch his campaign. 8 years later, it's almost inconceivable. I mean, we've had an endless kind of open migration process, but nothing like what's unfolding today. It's sheer chaos. It's run by these international cartels, which are global cartels, with online marketing and almost like travel services and travel agents facilitating this kind of satanic sex trade and human trafficking operation in the millions of people yearly, untouched by law enforcement, almost entirely backed. So I digress. The point being, Trump made that an issue. And now it's hard for any person. Many who didn't vote for Trump in 2016 didn't vote for him in 2020. Now it's public discussion. Tucker Carlson often references something Trump said that gave him an epiphany. Trump was asked about NATO. And he said something like, "Why do we need NATO? The Cold War has been over for 30 years. And Tucker Carlson said, "Oh my God, I've never thought about that before. And yeah, why do we need NATO? Why do we maintain these archaic structures based on a world that hasn't existed for an entire generation?" And that willingness to speak the truth about major questions, about how it is possible to rebuild manufacturing and industry, how we can build hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of power plants, how we don't have to allow our nation to be destroyed by drugs or homelessness. We don't have to have homeless camps in our cities. We don't have to have forever wars. Shut the wars down. Bring the troops back. Simple, direct, obvious solutions to problems that have just been festering for, really, in most cases, these problems have been festering for 25 years, an entire generation has grown up in a world of the World Trade Organization, globalization, forever wars, open borders, pro-drug policies, and all the rest. But what I want to touch on, so it's not surprising that some of those people who were born or born just prior to some of these policies being implemented are now, when painted with a clear difference between Trump's 4 years and what this regime has brought with Biden, and certainly it's really not Biden himself, but he's practically just a bank account from what all the reports indicate. It's a regime that there's an increasing growing support for Trump. And the threat of Trump is that, and as the British have said it in 2017, 2018, the House of Lords, The Economist just recently, a second term is untenable. Because to demonstrate that the truths Trump is speaking are increasingly real, that itself threatens this entire system, this globalist empire of lies. And that's what we intend to bring down, an entire globalist empire, really a British empire centered in London, where the financial and propaganda and intelligence center lies, which is in London. It has its hands in CIA and Wall Street or Brussels and so on, the Five Eyes, the Commonwealth. But it's centered in London. But it is a system, a global system of lies. And at core, it is a lie about the ability of the human mind and of the human species to solve any of these problems, which, as Trump has made very clear, most of our biggest problems are actually easy to solve. The only way you won't solve them is by continually to not attempt to actually solve them. So we're dealing with an intent to bring down an entire system of lies. At the core of that, and especially for anybody certainly under 50, emphatically under 40, because many people, the lie of, say, John Kennedy's assassination may be the big lie. For some, maybe 9/11 may be the big lie. But for the younger generation, and really, I think for everyone in this country, the big lie, in terms of action, not in terms of the structure of the system, but the action that indicates the nature of this enemy, can only be the bailouts of 2009 that have not stopped. Maybe you could say they stopped with quantitative tightening last year, but up until last year, 13 years straight, 13 plus years, 14 years going back to 2008, 15 years if you go back to the 2007 when the housing bubble began to blow. And Mr. LaRouche was very clear, the possibility of a non-collapse is impossible. This system is going. And it was the entire US and global financial system as it stood at that time. And that collapse became manifest, probably to some degree provoked, but yet manifest nonetheless in the 2008 Lehman Brothers collapse, September of 2008, right before the election. Just to give you a specific context to that, we were in discussion at that point with John McCain's campaign. We had written off Obama. We had, to some degree, thought that there may be some elements around Hillary, God forsake, but that seemed to be the best option at the time. But of course, she was unwilling to fight Obama and lost. We were in touch with John McCain's campaign, which had its own issues. John McCain had made major compromises since his 2000 campaign. But John McCain's campaign had the courage and the honesty at that point to say, when the Lehman Brothers went under, let's pause the campaign mutually, both major campaigns, pause them, and hold a discussion on what the federal government response should be, because it should not simply merely be in the hands of the current sitting Bush administration and Hank Paulson and the whole kind of Goldman Sachs crew, which was running the show. And Obama said, no, it's fine. I support the bailouts. He even went to the Congressional Black Caucus, which was somewhat, well, not somewhat, was entirely opposed to a program of massive hundreds of billions of dollars of immediate government expenditure. But mind you, ultimately, the amount of injection of various liquid funds at critical points is approximated somewhere between 20 and 30 trillion dollars in terms of the kind of financial games that were played to reinflate the financial system. So 20 to 30 trillion. But we were talking immediately about 1 trillion, or about $800 billion. Obama went to the Congressional Black Caucus and said, kick off your bedroom slippers, put on your shoes, and get behind me and shut up. And that was nearly a direct quote. Kick off your bedroom slippers, put on your work shoes, and do what you're basically told. You can fill in the derogatory epithets of what's implied in that remark. Now, this is when the Congressional Black Caucus still had a spine. I mean, at this point, 2008, it seems like a whole world ago in terms of even some of the basic institutions in our Congress. But what unfolded was, as I said, this has been identified by certain people who have studied it, and it may be inflated to a bit, but they've documented it, between 20 and 30 trillion dollars. What did that 30 trillion dollars accomplish? It reinflated the asset values of all of the instruments that were collapsing and going out. So it allowed all of those trades that were now sinking rapidly under this financial collapse of starting with the mortgage industry as the first domino, but then affecting the entire global financial system, including the insurance companies who insure the insurance companies and Wall Street banks, like American Insurance, AIG, and so on. The whole system was going. And they said, we're going to reinflate the values. Whatever you need to pay those values that were on the books, we'll make sure you have the money to pay them. Everything stays. So, of course, the stock market crashed. Housing values crashed. The working class and the people that had invested in these things lost massively. But if they simply decided to go with the program, if they had assets, if they had stock portfolios, if they had houses that they owned, if they had assets, then, and they just decided to let it ride, everything got reinflated. Remember, it was a shock when the Dow Jones reached 10,000 back then in 2008, 2007. It's now 33,000. It's tripled in value. So they not only brought people back, it dropped to maybe 65, 7 in the crash. It dropped like 30%. They've reinflated it by 300%. So not only did you make the money back, but if you just let it ride, you were basically bribed. And literally the American people with the stock portfolios, largely post-war generation to some extent, but stock portfolios, houses, assets, those things just kept climbing in value. The value of the dollar collapsed. The standard of living of people collapsed. Wage earners' standard of living drastically collapsed. The ability to form a family, to buy a home, all of these things collapsed. Even if interest rates were still rock bottom, they went up a bit afterwards, but they came back down. So a large portion of the American people have been bribed. Now, bribed on a Federal Reserve, Wall Street, with complete political complicity. I mean, Dick Cheney was on the floor of the House in that September period of 2008, threatening martial law if the bailouts weren't passed. They tried to vote on it Monday. The population was apoplectic in September of 2008, and the calls to Congress were so intense, the Congress voted down the TARP bailout. But by Friday, the bank lobby, the kind of the globalist oligarchs, the whole program came in and put such an intimidation, including Dick Cheney threatening martial law if they didn't vote for it. And of course, that's a legitimate threat from that administration. Oh, well, you just want chaos? Unfold the chaos, we'll declare martial law. Maybe you won't even have an election. I mean, coming from Dick Cheney, that's a legitimate threat. An unconstitutional and fascist one, but so they bailed out the system. And in doing so, they created the greatest wealth transfer out of the hands of many of the working class populations of our country and really globally, and moved it into what was the asset class, which may be a few retirees in the post-war generation, but is predominantly became the vanguards, the wealth management funds, the State Streets, the BlackRocks, the Blackstones, which Blackstone is a company that has bought up huge housing real estates, entire neighborhoods in some cases, to turn them into rental properties all over the country. These things weren't happening at that scale prior to 2008-9. It was the largest economic and financial looting of a people. And of course, we're talking about the most powerful and affluent country in the world. And you looted the population. You looted certainly the lower 50 by making their lives twice as hard to economically survive by the price inflation. But then you looted another large portion of the population, even if they didn't know it yet. You know, in COVID, they repeated the same phenomena. They actually, I don't know what the actual monetary issue of M1, M2 in this period was from 2008. In COVID, we know it was 6 trillion in new monetary issuance from the Fed. New money was issued of 6 trillion, putting I think the total in circulation at like 22 trillion. And again, a massive wealth transfer. Again, restaurants, small businesses were not considered critical work, necessary, whatever the justification was for necessary work. You know, the nurses and first responders or grocery workers, that was all critical. But everybody else, no, you can't work. You can't open your stores. You can't open up your industries or production plants. And they looted the population again, because that 6 trillion went again to the asset class, to the private equity funds, to the hedge funds. And the dollar value just keeps shrinking. Now, so I think that paints the case of how this current system is working and why I would consider that the greatest crime. Yes, it was inconceivable to launch a war, an aggressive war in a country like Iraq, who had nothing to do with 9/11, based on lies. But what's threatened by this kind of financial scheme is how they intend to organize the entire world system. That if they can do this to the United States and sustain that without any political blowback, they will be able to keep their boot on the heel, on the neck of any nation. And the level of population destruction and population loss will be inconceivable because of a lack of investments into power, water, food, industry, education, transportation, shipping, trade, that is critical to create a livelihood for 9 billion plus people that will increasingly be on this planet. And it will be, and for some way they can think of a scheme, this global oligarchy, this kind of British liberal system thinks of a scheme where a few people can maintain this kind of control with a financial system and still maintain a certain niche technological advancement that they can use for their private planes and so on. Now, but the point was to bring this back. So why does the current, as Barbara Boyd covered, and maybe Tony can post the article if people haven't seen it yet, from LaRouche PAC, the recent revelations of Matt Taibbi, not Greenwald, but Schellenberger and Gutentag on the intelligence and censorship control, what they indicate is that there's a top defense sector figure out of the UK that's also worked in the US, among many others, who were part of a program in 2018, 2019 that was working directly to create, called the Cyber Intelligence Threat League, that was working to basically censor the internet, build up these private partnerships and nonprofits at Stanford or other locations, to work with them as a kind of censorship industrial complex. And one of the things that is said is that Obama says in the White House in 2017, so around the same time he says to Susan Rice and Jim Comey and John Brennan, buy the book, do it by the book, basically run the coup against Trump by the book. At that same time, after Trump's elected, but before he's inaugurated, Obama says we can, to this cyber intelligence grouping, or at least this woman who's part of it in the room, we can never let 2016 happen again. The election can never happen again. And so for many people, this may be a kind of a breaking sense of how the British, especially, and British intelligence networks like Christopher Steele and others within MI6 and GCHQ ran much of the Russiagate program. But this idea of social media control is not something that emerged in 2016 or just prior. It's very obvious that when they committed to the bailouts, that may have been a panic, certainly a panic by some, and just we have to flood the system. We can't let the system go. And it was orchestrated by, as I mentioned, Goldman Sachs, working with banks in London, banks in Brussels, banks in Japan, all of whom were bailed out by the Federal Reserve. And not even banks, a lot of non-banks. Like I said, insurance companies and so on. That might have been a panic to implement. But once you take that action, very quickly, people at the highest levels of policy in this grouping were well aware that we have set something off. We have let a genie out of the bottle that no one knows the repercussions of. This experiment of the last 15 years of massive monetary printing and quantitative easing and the bailouts and propping up all this process. To some extent, there were similarities to what was done in Weimar Germany after World War I, where they printed tons of Reichsmarks. But it's a completely different kind of phenomena and a scale, and a global scale. It's not just one nation looking to pay its foreign debts by printing money, though there are direct similarities. They're talking about a global phenomena of all the major industrialized countries. It even includes nations like China, who have printed huge amounts of money over the last 10 or 15 years, though their relationship to some of this is different. At the highest level of this British Washington nexus, the same grouping that ran the coup against Trump, really orchestrated by Obama. And to some extent, this is still run by Obama at his mansion in Washington, D.C., like 2 miles from the White House. They met in January of 2009. It was a G8 summit. It was outside London. They discussed the globally significant international financial institutions, the name now for these institutions that were, as we know it, too big to fail. Well, once they're too big to fail, then they can never fail. And we're going to have to keep bailing them out. We're going to have to keep propping up the system. And now those institutions and any other institution which can join their ranks, like the Vanguards and BlackRocks and so on, they will always be protected at whatever cost it requires to the population. If that's what we've now committed to doing, and that's not something surprising from a British imperial outlook, But once it was acted upon and committed to, you then have to say, how do we control the population? It's one thing to tell the American people Vladimir Putin is Adolf Hitler every night on the television and build up at least a support for a war in Ukraine. Now, it's been a horrible disaster. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have been killed, lives destroyed. Tens of millions have been pushed out of Ukraine and probably elsewhere. And it's threatened a possible world war between the US and Russia of nuclear potential. So it's been a total disaster. But we're not talking, and the American people are becoming to realize it. But they could still use the old propaganda machine and even get a lot of MAGA supporters, at least to bite. And, there's all kinds of MAGA people that are really hardcore neocons, like Mark Levin or Sebastian Gorka. I heard these guys right after the war started. They were raving madmen for war. Okay, but we're not talking about getting people hot and bothered about some foreign monster, some alien foreign creature, Hitler type, Saddam Hussein, Vladimir Putin, whatever. We have to convince them that they need to increasingly become poorer, life become more difficult, their cities to become bankrupt and destroyed, their population to become homeless, their homes to become in disrepair. And maybe some neighborhoods and some areas will benefit, but a large portion of the working and middle class people are going to find their lives increasingly destroyed. Now, if they're smart and they move into areas where the financial sector is at play, if they get into wealth management, if they get into real estate, maybe they'll be better off. But if they're actually a productive, hardworking, trying to produce products, manufacturing, skilled trades, they're probably going to find themselves in some difficult periods here. And especially if they're young people, where now college tuition goes up by, it doubles in a few years. Healthcare costs double. Rents double or double every couple of years. The younger people are certainly going to be, but they're not quite aware of anything different. It'll just be tough. How do we convince them, though, that somehow this was all okay, all normal, that it's all understandable and acceptable and just the way society should work? Because that's really the goal, right? If you can acclimate people to total fascism without calling it, without the goose stepping and the raving lunatic, parades. If you can get it so that fascism is just kind of the way society works, and we're just going to, when we need to loot you, we're going to loot you. And if you've built up a lot of wealth, like you had in the United States compared to, say, South America or something, you're going to be looted more. In Europe, we're going to loot you more. And we've got to come up with a culture which justifies this, which justifies the looting of these populations, that they deserve it. Sound familiar? Sound like the woke agenda? That the American population is ultimately criminal in its nature? And that even though they've built up all this wealth, it should be distributed to other places? And that they should be looted? This didn't come from campus groups. I mean, they were indoctrinated to believe it. They were paid to get indoctrinated. But this was a cultural agenda. But they realized that you can't necessarily just have your nighttime newscasters. They can distract you. They can distract you with a new enemy in war. But they're not going to be able to brainwash you and create this culture. But they could try. But they realized, let's use social media. Facebook. Before Facebook, there was MySpace. Of course, MySpace is dead. It joined the graveyard of social media companies. Facebook became the chosen child. Twitter became the chosen child. And they quickly decided to see how these things could be deployed. And Barbara covered this somewhat extensively on Saturday. Places like the coup in Egypt in 2010, 2011. In Tunisia, in Iran in 2010. in Libya, in Syria, and then ultimately in Ukraine. They deployed the social media capability, what they called the Arab Spring. It was perhaps most notorious and orchestrated in Egypt, where you basically were able to build up a mob in the population, largely through a deployment of younger populations who were somewhat disillusioned generally in that country because of a lack of economic growth. And then with the social media deployments, build up certain messaging, certain programs, and create certain control. And if you limited certain feeds, if you limited certain concepts and promoted almost in kind of a manic mode, a certain kind of focus and direction, you could ultimately build up a head of steam that the rest of the population would buy into. Because the general frustration, a lack of the lack of beneficial economic conditions would make it so that the rest of the population could buy into it. This is what happened in Ukraine. A small layer of people that really wanted to buy into the EU were brought together into the Maidan in 2013, the plaza inside Kiev. And of course, they built that and built it always knowing that certain intelligence groups, like the various Nazi groups in Ukraine, would then be deployed to provoke the kind of military or martial coup that drove the president of the country out of office, overthrew the elected government, and brought to power a new Ukrainian government. And that's really the history of the war in Ukraine today. It goes back to that period of 2013, 2014. When Obama came into office in 2009, it was highlighted explicitly that Obama's top economic advisors were going to be people who had a background in behavioral economics. That was, how do we convince people that cat food is good, in essence? This became the major focus of Obamacare. As one of his top advisors said, we've got to convince people that the last year of life is the most expensive. So we should try to eliminate healthcare costs during the last year of life so that we can reduce healthcare costs and that way make health insurance lower priced and more affordable. And then we can provide public health insurance, or basically Obamacare, which is not public health insurance, even if that wouldn't work either. It's paying private insurance companies to run this kind of looting racket on the population. But go back to the core of it. When is the last year of life? Is this my last year of life? Is my 82nd year my last year of life? My 96th? So we have to convince people, they called it nudging, that we have to create a kind of social popularity, make it seem popular that, yeah, the last year of life is so expensive. Find marketing approaches, find ways of advertising, find symbols like fists that represent a kind of political resistance. Find things that people can identify with as a marketing or sloganeering type campaign and build that up using social media within the population and convince them that looting the population is a necessary requirement for justice, that it's understandable why the population was looted and that we bailed out the banks because ultimately the populations deserved it. And of course, in doing so, these youth mobs, these various ideological groupings are now no longer identifying with the population itself, but are identifying with the actual global oligarchs. And there I sense that we should punish the population. They've earned it. This is at core the role of the social media censorship program. And while Donald Trump's campaign ended up using Facebook to broadcast the basic need for infrastructure development all over the country, that was largely what Trump was advertising on Facebook in 2016. This was Jared Kushner's kind of department with incredible effectiveness, because what American doesn't drive on crappy roads and broken down infrastructure? where the power lines fall down, they don't get restored for days and days. So he then famously used Twitter, as we all know. He broke the algorithm. What was supposed to be used to control the population, with somebody who had a broad broadcasting appeal, they could now hijack those platforms and broadcast the actual explicit firing of James Comey, the head of the FBI. Where James Comey finds out he's been fired after Trump sent out the tweet, because it broadcasts on the news. People were watching him give a presentation. And behind him on the ticker tape, on the chyron, it said, James Comey has been fired as head of the FBI. Trump used social media and broadcast unfiltered directly to the population without going through the news, without going through a press release. He could act and speak directly to the population. And so he broke that mold. So why go through all of this? Well, I don't want to keep dragging on the story. I think I've painted a decent picture. People might have questions or just responses. But at the heart of this is organizing this younger generation and creating an increased solidarity within our nation to cross these generational gaps that have been artificially created, to see us as a single people with a common aim for a future for the nation and our civilization broadly on this planet, for multiple generations beyond any of us. We all share in that same hope. And at core is the ability to recognize an effective Trump administration will be one, and an effective campaign will be one waged to tear down this global financial racket. If there is not a commitment from the population to do that, not from the radical university kind of intelligence operations, but from the actual hardworking population that says, if it takes deflating at stock asset values or deflating house values or whatever it takes, whatever sacrifices we have to make today, and the government has to play a significant role to make sure that no one falls through the cracks in terms of how we reorganize this. But this financial system has to be reorganized. Otherwise, you're basically sleeping with Satan, even if you're getting up on the right side of the bed. That if we don't take a commitment, if we think we can just restore our nation by exposing censorship and going after the FBI, who do you think the FBI works for? It isn't the president, it's this global financial system and the various institutions and social programs that run it. And it's a commitment to shut that down. That means the Federal Reserve. It means going after Wall Street. It means stripping Wall Street of its ability to use our bank accounts as leverage to their gambling addiction. That's called Glass-Steagall. It means no longer does the Fed is controlled by a Wall Street and London cabal of banks and private interests. It's reconstituted as a national bank that abides by our Constitution. But it also means beyond any step one could foresee right now. If one makes it a formula, then one misses the point. And the formula is not retribution against these thieves merely. As Trump said, I will be your retribution. Amen, brother. We need that. But it's not sufficient. We want to set up a banking system that will ensure a livelihood and a future that's viable for generations today and generations coming after us. We're going to build up an actual social and economic structure that facilitates that. And whatever has to be shut down, whatever racket has to be called out, made illegal, and prosecuted, we're going to have to do that. That will take some investigations. It's going to find which institutions are actually willing to come onto our side and work with us to make this work. Compromise is fine, but on the principles that our nation is going to have to hold together, and that this world, that nations globally have to be given the opportunity to grow and thrive. They can't live under the oppression of a global financial system that has become more powerful than nations. And our nation has to defend that change in the system. If we are able to address this effectively, and Trump has all the capacity to do it, he has the policies put forward, but if increasingly our movement becomes this kind of movement and can call out the social media censorship for what it is, a Praetorian guard for this global financial racket, it will cut off the head of this leftist radical movement, which is all premised on this financial bailout and the injustice of it. It will cut the head off that beast, and it will largely mobilize all of the American people to recognize that we are in this together. And that if we're going to survive, it's going to be by unifying and rebuilding the nation. So, like I said, that's the strategic assessment I wanted to give tonight. Hopefully people can find that useful. And I think Tony and I would both like to hear from people and what your thoughts are. So Tony, I'll hand it back to you for any thoughts or comments.